subject today is the ideas and life, mainly of Syed Ahmad Khan, but the whole movement associated with him, which became known as the A Allawi. The A Allawi movement is named after, of course, the famous university that he was instrumental in founding, and which was very important. I would say one of the most important elements in the making of the Indian Muslim mind. The Muslims of India were profoundly influenced by the works and the thought of Syed Ahmad Khan, who, to put it mildly, was a very controversial and in some ways contradictory figure. And part of the identity of Muslims from the Indian subcontinent, as India and Pakistan, can be attributed to their relationship with the school of Syed Ahmad. And to some extent, this mindset, as it were, continues until modern times. There is a certain perspective, there's a certain set of values, there's a certain perception for a certain group of Muslims from the Indian subcontinent that can be directly related to the thoughts and works of Syed. He is known generally in India and Pakistan as Syed. If you recall from the note that I gave you, he was born from a quite a well-established functioning family in 1870. And his family originally came from Herat, from Afghanistan, but being a Syed, obviously he traced his lineage to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was in fact very proud of that. And his lineage to the Prophet was a very important element in his overall makeup and his overall profile. And he was very conscious of the impact that this title, this honorific, had in terms of his relationship with Muslims in general. So, as I said, his family came originally from Herat, but that was probably 2 or 3 generations before his birth. They were important functionaries in the Mughal Empire. They served the empire in various capacities, but primarily in the court as judges, as court-appointed administrators, and there was a number of references and allusions to them in the 2 or 3 generations preceding the birth of Syed. This group, or such a group of people, who came with the Mughals from what is now Afghanistan, and ensconced themselves and became Indianized, as it were, formed basically the Muslim elite in the country. Very crudely put, India was Islamicized over 2, possibly 3 waves. Wave number 1, of course, was in the very early days of Islam, and with the conquest of Muhammad ibn Qasim of what is now Sind. That was the first wave. Second wave was a series of incursions. That came from what is now known as Afghanistan, but primarily from the northwestern part, places what was known historically as Greater Khorasan, starting from Mahmud al-Ghaznawi in the 10th century, 10th and 11th century, right on to the establishment of what we now know as the Mughal Empire by Babur in the 16th century. So you had this is India, as it were, very crudely put. The invasions came primarily from this part of the world, what is now Greater Khorasan, and the main influence over the empire came from the control of the Muslims over the northern and northwest stretch of it. And the empire spread, ebbed and flowed, depending on the strength of the rulers, depending on the mix of forces that they had to contend with, and also depending on the success of the rulers in maintaining a semblance of intercommunal balance between the minority Muslims and the majority Hindus. By the time of Sir Syed's birth in 1817, the empire had really seriously decayed. Probably the last great ruler was Aurangzeb, and he ran the empire of what is now India. Large sections of it were directly under the control of the emperor. Parts of it were under the control of independent Hindu states. But between the 17th century and the early 19th century, the power of the Mughals began to shrink, dramatically shrink, under attack from what were known as Rajputs, Hindus from the western part of India, from Sikhs, from the growth of Sikhism in the Punjab, and from the Mughals. As a result, the form of the empire was maintained, in the sense that there was an emperor, but the reality of the empire was dissipated, with most of India coming under the control of local princes, warlords, and starting from the 18th century with the incursion of the British in Bengal, which began to take large parts of the most productive parts of India, especially Bengal, directly under the control of the British, who operated in India through the aegis of the East India Company. Now, East India Company deserves a whole lecture, not lecture, deserves a whole class to it. It was a commercial company that gradually was given initially monopoly trading rights in India by the British Crown, but over time began to establish itself more than a company and became basically a state. And as a result of a series of clever alliances and successful military campaigns, they began to expand the area under their control away from Bengal, and large parts of India became linked in the commercially or through military alliances with the East India Company. So in 1817 at his birth, you had an emperor who really had no power outside of his capital in Delhi, with a number of feudal and other Hindu, mainly Hindu principalities, owing him nominal allegiance in maintaining the fiction of the state, while the British managed to extend their authority and influence to this northwest part of India, which became subsequently known as the United Provinces. So towns such as Lucknow, Agra, Aligarh, Delhi, and so on, all came from this part, the United Provinces. So when he began his life, he was part of an aristocracy, an Urdu-speaking, Persian-influenced aristocracy that was attached to a court that was really crumbling, had no power, with the bulk of the Muslim population being either very, very poor peasants in Bengal or in Punjab, with a small Muslim artisanal class in the major towns and cities. So he came into basically a crumbling structure, the last days or the last embers of Muslim rule. And in the context of those times, there really wasn't much for him to be offered at the court. The court really didn't have much to offer his type of person. The family of functionaries and bureaucrats who supported the Mughal emperor were no longer needed. So they had these huge titles, grandiloquent titles, Amin al-Sadr al-A'la, with no function, no reality to it. So when Sir Syed reached the age where he was, of course, taught and raised in the traditional way, deeply influenced by the Arabic language, Persian literature, high-class Urdu, as it were, and which was the language of the court at that point. But when he came of age, when he was in his 20s, he obviously had nowhere to go. There was no employment. So he did something which was really very unusual for a Muslim of the nobility, as it were, of that time. joined the service of the British Raj, or the East India Company. He was, in his young days, he was influenced by his maternal grandfather, a man by the name of Khawaja Farid Ahmad, who played a very important part as one of the lead advisors and maybe called the Prime Minister of the last Mughal emperors. On his father's side, his father himself became a recluse and avoided the company of people. So he was much more under the influence of his mother and particularly his maternal grandfather, Khawaja Farid Ahmad. In 1837, he joined the services of the British East India Company and became ensconced, as it were, or became part of their administrative setup, rising through various hierarchies until he became a kind of local court judge, circuit judge, as it were, for the British East India Company, with the title of Munsif. It seems to be the way that the court hierarchy or judiciary in India, before it became entirely under the rule of the British, was organized. So the East India Company used actually a lot of the administrative structures of the Mughal Empire and kept them alive, but obviously used them for other purposes. Anyway, in fact, one of his first works of Syed dealt with the monuments and the decays or the decaying monuments of the Mughal Empire. That was really the theme of his early life. That is the decline and near fall of Muslim power, a sense of loss, a sense of grandeur and splendor of days gone by, and his book on the antiquities of Muslim relics in India perhaps best exemplifies this sense of being part of a system that has begun to lose its raison d'etre. In 1857, a very important event took place that defined really the history of India and the history of subsequent effects on the Muslims. And here we're talking about what the Indians call the Great Rebellion or the Insurrection, or the British called Mutiny in 1857. Now, the mutiny, there were a large number of causes behind it, but the most immediate one is the rebellious mutiny of a number of Indian regiments attached to the British East India Company. These people were called sepoys, which comes from the Persian word sipa, which you might know as troops or soldiers. The immediate cause was related to the issuance of bullets that required the sepoys or the soldiers to bite them off. And there was some, before they could be fired, or before they could be inserted into a rifle. And the Muslims said that there was pig fat on them, and the Hindus said there was cow fat. In any case, this was really the trigger, as it were, that started the mutiny. It became quickly widespread throughout the northern and northwest part of India, and was to a very large extent led by Muslims. Muslim landlords who felt they were threatened by the encroachments of the East India Company, merchants and vendors who felt again that they were being eased out of their economic role, the Muslim rulers and nawabs of various states who saw their authority and power shrinking. There was a large number of causes behind the so-called mutiny or insurrection. The immediate spark that spread it off was the mutiny of key regiments in places like Kanpur and so on, which subsequently led to whole-scale uprising and the conquest of large parts of North and Northwest India to the cause of the mutineers, with the British being reduced to key bastions in India, places like Lucknow, where there were old forces of residency, Calcutta and so on, awaiting reinforcement. And in this mutiny, in this insurrection, Syed, who was then a Munsif or a circuit judge of the East India Company in a town called Meerut, did something really that can be interpreted as either as a great humanitarian act or it can be interpreted as treasonous or treachery against the Muslim insurrectionists. Here in Europe, as the insurrectionists took over and British authority collapsed, there was a very serious threat against the British civilian population in Europe. And he, here in his capacity as Monsignor or Secretary, took over the responsibility of protecting these people. And he formed a kind of protective group with the local Hindu community to stop these people being either massacred or attacked, and to organize their safe exit from Europe. This, as I said, could be interpreted, and has been interpreted in one or two ways. Either that he was beginning to position himself to become a leading light of the Muslim community in India, knowing that the British are going to win out in the end. Or you could see it as a person who saw that the immediate humanitarian need to protect innocent women and children from attacks by disorderly and sometimes completely chaotic mutineers and rioters. Sir Syed's main biographer is a man called Hadi, and I'll read you one of his poems later on, inshallah. Hadi says that he was motivated mainly by humanitarian causes, and he describes Sir Syed in 1857, after he was only about 40, as being extremely pietistic, a person who was always engrossed in prayers and supererogatory acts of ibadat, and that he was motivated mainly or prompted primarily by impulses to do with the correct modes of conduct, the way that you have to protect non-Muslims if they're under your control, the protection of innocence and so on, rather than a calculated exercise of trying to position himself for the future domination of India by the British. In his first 30 or 40 years, he also exhibited, he was a very prolific writer of pamphlets in his young days, and he exhibited a very strong orthodoxy, Sunni orthodoxy. He wrote a number of tracts against the Wahhabis, whom, if you may recall from an earlier lecture, they were quite important in India as a result of the missionary work of Ahmad, of Syed Ahmad Garawi. You might remember his name as one of those who became a backer of the Wahhabi movement as a result of his presence in Mecca in the 1820s. Anyway, Wahhabism was very well established in India, and by the time the mutiny took place, and the Wahhabis, through the efforts of the Garawi group, became quite important in trying to resist the encroachments of both the British on one hand, as well as Hindus and Sikhs in other parts of India against Muslim power. So Syed got involved in a number of polemics against them and against Wahhabism generally. After the mutiny, what happened after the mutiny? He comes out of the mutiny as a person who was loyal to the British. He did not involve himself in any shape or form in supporting the mutineers or the causes of the mutiny. He comes off as being a person to whom the British owe some debt, in the sense that he helped them retake Beirut, but more importantly, he helped them in maintaining order and protection for the British community, for the English community in Beirut. So he came out of it, one of the few Muslims who were not implicated, directly or indirectly, by their involvement in the mutiny. After 1857, the concessions that the East India Company had in India were all abolished, and India came directly under the rule of London, and the whole system of government that we associate with India, with viceroys and so on, was established after the putting down of the rebellion, the Great Rebellion. So, coming out of a rebellion, or coming out of mutiny, where the British thought the Muslims as being the prime instigators the prime supporters of the mutineers, people who were incapable of adjusting to British rule, people who are incapable of adjusting to the rule of non-Muslims. You can say that the perceptions of Muslims by the British specifically were formed by a number of factors. One of them is the sense that Muslims are historically hostile to Christians and therefore will never allow themselves to be reconciled to Christian, in this case, British rule. The other problems or the other causes that made the British fear the Muslims in India before the rebellion was the sense that here we have a ruling class or a ruling community, Muslim community, that has seen its power shrink and has seen its power replaced or displaced, as the case may be, and displaced communities that were formerly in a leading position are frequently a source of great instability because they do not accept the legitimacy of present rule and always hark back to the times when they were in charge. The third factor that affected the British perception of Muslims related to the Wahhabi threat. As I said, the Wahhabis were quite an important source of instability in India in the mid-19th century and were involved in a number of expeditions, both against the Sikhs as well as against the British. So there was another element here that encouraged the British to think of Muslims as being inherently incapable of accommodating to their rule. The last item, the last issue is the fact that the Ummah of Islam implied that Muslims have divided loyalties that went beyond their own state, that their links with Muslims of other countries may be much stronger than the links with their non-Muslim rulers or with their non-Muslim neighbors. So these factors added to the general climate of anti-Islamic sentiment that was propounded by European intellectuals and philosophers who had a very important influence on the way public opinion was formed, created a situation where Muslims were in some ways suspect even before the Great Rebellion of 1857. So when the reaction took place, when the British reconquered those parts of India that fell under the control of the mutineers, there was really very, very ferocious reaction, including destruction of mosques, including turning most of the great monuments of Islam in Delhi into barracks, into places that had nothing to do with their religious functions, raising of the area between the Great Fort and the Jama Masjid in Delhi, if you've seen it. It's now all shops, but before it was much more densely populated. It had people there living there. It was a living, thriving community. They raised it and turned it into a great open space to allow their cannons to operate much more effectively. This is the immediate reaction. There was huge numbers of people who were executed. The figures range in the tens of thousands, including very, very pathetically and tragically, the two sons of the emperor, the last emperor of India, Bahadur Shah, who were hanged in front of him in Burma. He was sent to exile in Burma, and they trotted out his two kids and strung them up in front of him. So when the British came, apart from the immediate reaction, which was, as I said, ferocious, it was had great elements of cruelty and hostility, particularly directed against Muslims. Hindus were also swept up in it, but in a much more selective way. Muslims were generally considered to be suspect elements. They started taking basically irreversible steps in cleaning up the administrative structures of power and rule in India. And they took over, for example, all the Persian language schools, which were the medium which the Muslim ruling classes or ruling elite educated their children. They abolished all the Oriental, what were called the Oriental departments attached to the British East India Company. These were all abolished and tens of thousands of people were thrown out on the street without jobs. The empire, or what was left of the empire, part of which were inherited by the East India Company, was to a large extent manned at the higher levels by Muslims. They were all removed. And they started moving people around, firing people, changing the composition, the ethnic composition of various government departments, and generally reduced the influence of Muslims in political, social, and educational life. So these were measures that were taken immediately against the Muslims and went on between the period of mutiny and the time when that policy began to change, sometime around the 1870s. So when Sir Syed came out of the mutiny, this was the environment that he was operating in. Environment of official anti-Muslim hostility, an environment where the Muslims were really dispossessed. They found themselves losing whatever relationships they had with the state. Their power, the dispossession of the Mughal emperor was complete. Even his theoretical powers were removed. The entire structure of Muslim rule in India was dismantled. And he saw this in front of him. And his solution was really to accommodate. His solution was to create, again, a response somewhat similar to the latter part of Muhammad Abdu, but in this case, far more pervasive, far deeper response. Muhammad Abdu's response was, to some extent, still based upon a large mass of individuals and groups who could form a kind of ruling group in Egypt that were able to create, as it were, a unified position vis-à-vis the British. There was still some degree of autonomy between what Muhammad Abdu was saying and how he wanted to see Muslims, in particular Egyptians, relate to the presence of British power in Egypt. Of course, British power in Egypt was much more conditional also. It wasn't the way it was in India. In India, it was, to some extent, total. And India was integrated directly into the administrative structures of London and Westminster. So, he embarked on the second phase, as it were, of his activities, which was to come up with a series of policies and programs that would have two effects. One of them is to reduce the natural fear and the natural distaste of the ruling class, in this case the British, to the Muslims. And from another perspective, to uplift the Muslims in a way that would allow them to at least regain some or all of their former role as the leaders and initiators of action, of thought, and defining the character, as it were, of indigenous India. So, this is when he started talking about what he calls the Qawm. This word will come up quite frequently in the future in defining the identity of Muslims. This is the name that they refer to themselves, they call themselves the Qawm. And his writings now began to reflect primarily concern about the Qawm, how the Qawm is going to reorganize itself, restructure itself, how the Qawm is going to position itself to be able to reach a kind of acceptable, not accommodation, but acceptable integration. Sheikh Muhammad Abdu was looking for accommodation. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was looking more towards integration of the Muslims within the structure of British rule. And that defined really the rest of his life. He became convinced that the British were there to stay, that British rule was permanent. Not only was it futile, but it was destructive to try to oppose it. And that the job of the Muslims, the role of Muslims, is to understand what in their history brought them into this situation, and to understand what they can gain, and how they can, from the British, and from the British system of government and administration, and in particular education, and how they can reposition themselves from being a feared, disliked community into being partners with the British in ruling India. Basically, he wanted the Muslims or the Qawm to come back as the ruling class of India by integrating themselves with the aims and targets and objectives of British policy. To some extent, there is, again, modern parallels to that. Those who want to do the same with the Americans, just substitute the word British with Americans, and although the British were involved in the territorial domination of part of the world, there is that school of thought within current the Muslim firmament, as it were, that calls for adjustment to the dominant view of whatever is the leading power of the world in order to protect and preserve yourself, falls into that line of apologist thinking. He wrote in those early days, I think around 1860, a commentary on the Bible, mainly written to show Muslims that the Bible is not really a book that is distorted, which is as you know, the accepted Muslim understanding of what the current Bible is. That it is a book that has been distorted, tahrif. But rather, it is a complete book and is in many ways a legitimate religious text. He does not have, or did not write in his book, which is called Tabyin al-Kalam, that the Bible is, in fact, muharraf, that the Bible that we have in front of us is something that is to be not taken as of being of any consequence because of the distortions and discrepancies that were deliberately introduced into that. He said that, no, Muslims should read the Bible in order to understand the sacred text of Christians and understand that the Bible that we have today is not necessarily as complete and as total as the Quran, but in its own way is a religious and an authentically religious text. He also wrote a number of pamphlets about the impermissibility of jihad against rulers, including rulers who are non-Muslim. He wrote a pamphlet to that, saying that there is no injunction that binds Muslims to reject, as a matter of their deen, a matter of their faith, the rule of non-Muslims, in fact any ruler. That any ruler should not, even if he's the most criminal, even if he's the most outrageous tyrant, does not necessarily imply that Muslims should go on jihad. He interprets, these things will come later, inshallah, to his tafsir of the Quran, these key terms that he interprets in a way that were more symbolic, more indicative than they have been given historical accuracy, accounting for. He wrote also pamphlets on the multiple marriages are not really allowed in Islam because the Quranic verse dealing with multiple marriages is specific about the need to maintain equality between wives, and since that is impossible, then the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not to indulge. He wrote another pamphlets on the issue of what the Indians call purdah or niqab, complete hijab, and again he proves, quote unquote, its impermissibility, that it's something that goes against the injunctions, not the injunctions, but it goes against Islam as such. He did not really believe in injunctions. He also, all of this output that he had, all of these outpourings were to a large extent designed in order to create a system of accommodation to allow him to reintegrate the Muslims as a community, as a whole, with, and to reconcile the Muslims with British rule in India. So, he wrote another pamphlet or a booklet on the causes of the Indian revolt. Don't forget, throughout this time he was still an employee of the British government, in the sense that he continued to be acting as a munsib, or what became known as a circuit judge afterwards. And instead of working for the East India Company, he ended up working for the successor to that, which is the British government, the British Raj. And he tried to outline the causes behind the revolt, behind the mutiny, which he, to some extent, blamed on, not so much on the activities of the British against the native population, but to some extent, he blamed it on the ignorance by the Muslim community, specifically, of the intentions of the British. He also blamed it partly on the existence of laws and regulations that were promulgated by the British without taking into account local customs of Indians and particularly of Muslims. And he also blamed it on the ignorance of the condition of the people and the neglect of the army and bad management on the part of the British East India Company. All of these really began to flow into the beginning of the formulation of his key contributions, which are in his education philosophy. He began to formulate in his own mind, and then much more publicly, the elements of the educational rebirth of the Muslim community. How does this community, which is now this downtrodden, defeated, disgruntled, in some ways withdrawing from contact with the ruling order, very, very poor mostly, with its ruling groups completely alienated. How do these people begin the process of restructuring their lives, reordering their lives in order to begin to move into the situation which they have inherited, which they find themselves in, and a situation which he explains is impossible to change at a political level. His first stab at it is basically to reject the policies of a man called Macaulay. You may have come across Macaulay. Macaulay is a British political philosopher of the early 19th century. And he wrote a very influential book on how the British should handle ruling groups that were not of their own ethnic composition. How do the British maintain their control over empires, over large territories, with few resources and few people? Basically, how do you control the 500-600 million people of India of those days with not more than 20,000 people? And this kind of policy actually began to be implemented wherever empires, European empires, spread. Basically, what Macaulay said is that you pick a select group, mainly from the elites of those societies, and you detach them from their native inheritance. You detach them from their philosophical and to some extent religious routines. Give them a completely and thoroughly Western education. And in the case of England, give them a specifically English education. Teach them Latin and Greek, teach them how to play cricket, teach them how to think like English gentlemen, start drinking tea at 4 o'clock and crumpets and have porridge for breakfast. Make sure that the kind of mores, the kind of customs that they begin to develop are those that are similar to the ruling classes, to those of the British. And in the process, you create a group of people who may look like the natives, may look brown, black, or may look as if they're part of the scene, but who think entirely different way, who think exactly like us. And this brown or black on the outside, white on the inside, we propose that the British education policy should be aimed at creating colleges and creating systems of education that entices the children of the former ruling classes into this kind of process and get them to take on all the attributes of the English, and in the process become loyal allies and friends to the ruling power. This was Macaulay's famous education policy of 1835, which became the standard educational policy of the British wherever they went in Asia and Africa. And it was only replaced much later. It was modified, but generally it kept on that phase. And in this in this critique of Macaulay, Syed Ahmad Khan began to formulate the core, as it were, of his own education philosophy. He said that you cannot really begin to affect, and he's talking, don't forget, about the Muslims, about the Qawm. You cannot affect the mind of the Qawm in a serious way unless you teach them in their own language. That is, although English is the modicum or the medium by which you are going to try to affect them, this has failed with the Muslim community because the Muslim community resists, for religious reasons, being absorbed into this kind of system, and at the same time are ignorant of the benefits of this kind of system. So basically what we're telling them is that you're wasting your time with the Muslims with this kind of policy because the Muslims do not understand what you're doing, they're ignorant of what you're trying to do. At the same time, the Muslims will not allow their children to be educated in a strange language, a foreign language, in the language of Christians, which is a language that is alien, if not antithetical to Islam. So the education policy of the British vis-a-vis India should be divided to have a specific policy relating to the Muslim community. And the Muslim community should be therefore taught in its own language, in its own medium. You should reintroduce the teaching of Arabic, you should reintroduce the teaching of Persian, you should reintroduce the teaching of the Quranic sciences, fiqh, so on, hadith, in order to begin the process of trying to entice the Muslims into a kind of strategic alliance with the British. And to really to act out his theories, as it were, he started the first so-called modern school, where he took over a Persian school, Persian language school, in a place called Muradabad, and grafted onto it basic sciences, but particularly the teaching of modern history. And this was his first attempt, as it were, to put some of his ideas in practice. That is, the future of Muslims and the future of Islam in India is directly dependent on the quality and level of their education and their educational performance. This didn't last long, this attempt to graft, as it were, modern languages and modern history onto a traditional curriculum. And he basically abandoned that, changed his views dramatically in 1862, and began to think along different lines. He says that we must not just add one or two aspects of modern education onto a traditional system. What we should do now is to, in fact, move into an entire different mode, translate into the vernacular, into Urdu or into Hindi, the major texts of the 19th century Victorian period into the vernacular and teach these as part of the reform of the curriculum for Muslim students. And he started a society called the Ghazipur Scientific Society, which was called Ghazipur because that's where he was living at that point. He then moved to a town called Aligarh, which is in one of the cities of the United Provinces, and the society changed its name from the Ghazipur Scientific Society to the Aligarh Scientific Society. He became the head of that, and the purpose of that society was to start a program of translation of major historical and political works, mainly of Victorian England, into the local language of Urdu and Hindi. In reality, they only translated these works into Urdu, and by 20 years, they translated something like 25 books. The other purpose of this society, the Aligarh Scientific Society, was to improve the processes and the methods of agriculture. And here they started a model farm. This was probably the first model farm in the Muslim world, and used experimental techniques of farming and seeds and so on. But the primary thrust was towards the scientific translation of established texts of Victorian England. This society, the Aligarh Scientific Society, became the core of what became subsequently the first Muslim college in 1864. They built their first building in Aligarh, 1866, and they called it the Aligarh Institute. As part of the output of the institute, they had a magazine which was very, very influential in formulating and advancing the ideas and thoughts of Syed. It's called the Aligarh Institute Gazette. And this probably was certainly the most influential journal in India in the propagation of the educational philosophy and the educational theories of Syed. Most of the articles that were published in the Gazette were of a social and educational nature. At that point, the British began to take notice of what he was doing and began to see him as a potential ally. Sometime around the mid-1860s, with the installation of a man called Lord Mayor, who was the viceroy, that's the chief governor. Lord Mayor began to consider ways in which he can selectively revise the British hostility to the Muslims. Driven really not by any love for Islam, but driven by the fact that the British Empire was in charge of huge numbers of Muslims. And the presence of Muslims under direct British control obviously had an impact in the great balance of power games that they played with the Turks and the Russians and so on. So they began to see him and see his attempts at creating Muslim educational institutions in a positive way. And they began to support his activities. In particular, they began to support his call for the formation of a university. He wanted a university, but he settled for a college initially that would be focused on carrying out his educational philosophy and theory. And they supported him by the Muslim college was known as the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College. And he kept on using the word Muhammadan throughout his writing to the British. As I said, it's a very unfortunate choice. But in those days, the word Muhammadan did not really, well, it did, but it was an acceptable form of reference to Muslims. It doesn't have the same kind of connotation as it does now, because now you associate Muhammadan, but it is not the religion of Islam. You tend to associate it with the religion of the Prophet. When he started the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College, which became in 1920 Muslim Aligarh University, I'll call it that now because I don't like this name. The Muslim Aligarh University, the philosophy behind it was obviously Syed Ahmad Khan's, but when he came back from England, he had an essay competition where he asked for essays from any number of people on really three themes. Why are there more Hindus than Muslims in education? And some of the figures that I'll give to you, 1870, for example, in Bengal, there was about 110,000 Hindus registered in schools, in secondary schools, compared to 14,000. Now in Bengal, the majority of the population was Muslim, and they had less than 12% of the student population. Why was that? Why were Muslims more reluctant to go to school, to modern schools, than Hindus? The other aspect, the other questions that he raised in his essay competition to be answered, why was there a decline in interest in what he called Oriental learning, what really means Quranic sciences and Islamic sciences. And the third question is, why are Muslims not taught modern sciences, languages, and arts? Now, on the basis of these essays, he got back about 50 or 60 responses, and these really formulated the basic charter of the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, or what became the Muslim Medical University. And there, his main principle first was to answer these questions. Of course, to answer them positively. That we intend to reverse the lack of Muslim representation in higher education and secondary education because of the resistance of Muslims to what he called Christian ideals. Therefore, since Islam is par excellence the religion of reason and the religion of accommodation, we must teach in this college the Islam that allows for this kind of reconciliation between various faiths. So, an important element of the curriculum was a kind of rereading of the basic tenets of the Deen of Islam, a rereading of the importance of the Quran and the Hadith and the Seerah and the Sharia in their relative sense, and an attempt to reinterpret the true aspects of what he thought of as the true aspects of Islam in a way that would allow for the accommodation of Muslims with modern education. While in the past we were talking about, for example, Sheikh Hamid Abdu or others like, stressing the accommodation of Islam with modern sciences, that modern sciences can all be understood and seen in the context of the Islamic heritage broadly understood. So Syed recognized that a large part of what people were being taught in these schools was really went against the grain of the inherited traditions of Islam. His answer to that was not to try to find explanations and excuses or justifications within this traditional framework, but rather to reject the entire framework. And he came up with I would say he was probably the first one to radically enunciate the principle that Islam is really based upon the Quran only, and that the Quran can only be understood in the context of the capacities of the human mind. That there is no extraordinary or supernatural revelatory nature to it. And at the same time, the whole body of traditions and hadith were immaterial to understanding of the Quran, and it should therefore not be seen as binding or as forming the core of a person's religious beliefs, but rather should be seen as merely historical texts that are of interest and as guidance for those who are living in the time and age when those were important.
So, sorry, is he saying that the Quran has no relevance to the time that he was living in then?
No, he was saying that the hadith have no relevance. The hadith. But the Quran itself must be read in a certain way. But the way it's to be read is within the context and capacities of the human mind. And if the human mind can only respond to reason, and can only respond to what he called nature, what he really meant was science. Therefore, there's no other acceptable way of approaching the Quran except from the perspective of reason, from the perspective of science. Things that do not fit the traditional explanations, for example, for miracles or the Isra wal Mi'raj of the Prophet should not be explained or justified in their traditional sense, because he rejects also authority. He rejects taqlid. He basically rejects the Sharia in its inherited form. And all that really is to create a system of thought that allows Muslims to maintain the form of Islam, as it were, and to reduce Islam to a kind of spiritual or kind of spirituality, spiritual relationships, denuded of any historical inheritance. And the historical inheritance that he's referring to, obviously, is the Sharia taqlid. And he explains that, and I'll go into that later. Why are these unimportant? He says, in the case of the Sharia, the stability inherent in it, that is, we approach it as a completely formulated set of laws. These sets of laws cannot be static. They have to be dynamic. Static laws are valid for static societies. If we have societies that are basically agricultural with peasants in the vast majority, very little changes from season to season or from generation to generation. So a law or a code of conduct designed for one age will continue to be valid in subsequent ages simply because things don't change. It's a static world. But in the context of 19th century imperialism, as it were, we're talking about a world that has been turned upside down by all kinds of inventions, by all kinds of incursions, by expansions of European powers, and so on, and that change and dynamism is inherent in that. Change and dynamism is inherent in the nature of society. Therefore, the Sharia, in terms of what has been inherited to us, is of no value because it relates to a static society. And since seen from that context, being the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by its very nature, has to change with time because change is now the spirit of the ages. Again, you see a lot of this kind of thinking emerge time and time again, also in current, in modern days, and in contemporary times.
Could I ask, is he reacting into the interpretation of the Sharia by the ulama, or the Sharia itself?
No, the Sharia itself. Of course, he's against taqlid, it's not a matter, yes. But the Sharia itself, if you take, I mean, he says in one of his pamphlets, that if you take all the rulings, all the injunctions on various activities that derive their validity from the Seerah of the Prophet or the Sunnah of the Prophet or the Imam of the Sharia, and if you relate that to specific injunctions of the Quran, you end up this huge body of laws and decrees and do's and don'ts are really valid for societies that don't change. Since we're living in societies that have changed and are changing daily, this process that we have is really of no use to us. You cannot take, whatever is the merit of the case, you cannot take a law or a code of conduct of 2, 3, 5,000 years ago and apply it today. Not because there is something intrinsically wrong with it. You have to reinterpret it in the context of what is valid today, not in the valid of the circumstances and conditions of 200 or 300 years ago. He does not deny the validity of Sharia in its time, as most people don't, but he denies the utility of Sharia in today's world, simply because it's a world of change, and there is nothing that is constant in the Quran, except for very, very few things. A common thing. He, of course, when saying that, he had his main eye, as it were, his ear cocked to what the British were expecting from him. And this may be partly the reasons why he propounded these theories or these ideas. I personally believe that he actually believed, he genuinely believed that these were the proper interpretations, the proper readings of the Quran. That he didn't do them purely as a stooge of the imperial power. He did that because he thought that the Muslims of India, could not possibly break out of the hole that they were in, except by a wholehearted assumption of the techniques of the modern world. And to do that, they have to overcome the serious reluctance, religious reluctance, to accept the existence of non-Muslim schools, that the schools that don't fit in the traditional mold or the traditional curriculum. So his theological thought, as it were, can be summarized as only the Quran matters. A hadith as a source of legislation or as a source of personal conduct are not really valid. The Sharia itself is an invalid body of law, an invalid body of conduct, as a set of laws. Although there is something called the Sharia of Allah. The Sharia of Allah is really what we as men believe to be the correct reading of the Quran, using the capabilities that we have as individuals. And he always said that he is as knowledgeable about the Quran as anybody before him. What does it take to reach the state of knowledge of the Quran? He may not be knowledgeable about the ahadith and about the seerahs as historians, but any person is capable of understanding the Quran if seen from the perspective of the two faculties that we have been given in order to read it, reason and the laws of science. Of course, again, this raises a whole set of other questions. He was very much against taqlid also. He was taqlid against any alim and following the injunctions or the ordinances of any person in matters of what is religiously correct. He reduced the Quran, therefore, to really a set of moral principles. He made it an ethical book, a book of limits to personal, ethical, and moral conduct. It is not related to a group. There is no such thing as a community of people who are brought together by a set of rules and by a set of principles that are Quranically based. They are only individuals, and these individuals relate to the Quran in two perspectives. One, from the perspective of what is reasonably and scientifically understood. And the other perspective is what is ethical and moral. So, reducing Quranic tafsir to this is obviously a major, he threw the cat amongst the pigeons, as it were. And naturally, he became subject to a huge barrage of attacks against him. Attacks against him by nearly all the ulama. There's a man called Abdul Hayy, Mawlawi Abdul Hayy, was probably the most learned alim in India at that time, a place called Farangi Mahal, who denounced everything to do with Sir Syed, denounced the college, condemned anybody associated with this program of Muslim educational upliftment, and condemned its author and its perpetrator as a satanic influence, a shaitan influence. And there were entire newspapers devoted to just attacking him, attacking the Muslim Aligarh University and attacking his concept of education. And he got a fatwa, this Mawlawi Abdul Hayy, from the alims of Mecca, in fact authorizing his killing, that this is something that would be to the service of Muslims if you remove this person from the face of the earth.
Could I just ask this question? His time and Sheikh Abdul's, are they
about the same, yes.
At the same time?
Well, he died before Sheikh Ahmad. He died in the 1880s, after the college was established, and he saw it as it began to really become started off in a very fragile way. But within a few years it became the preferred institution for the Muslim elite to send their children to, or to send to get their university education. And sometime by the end of the 19th century, something like a quarter of all Muslims in the hierarchy of the Raj, of the British rule in India, were graduates of the Aligarh Muslim University. Of course, Aligarh Muslim University went through another cycle later on, but it basically created this class of people who thought of Islam primarily as an individual matter, thought of Islam primarily as a set of moral values. To them, Islamic civilization was more of a cultural phenomenon than it was a religious community of Muslims. You find a lot, not a lot, but you find quite a few people, especially in the upper echelons of the intellectual elites of the subcontinent, amongst the Muslims. This kind of attitude still. Attitude of personal piety, extreme tolerance of diversity, not only of within Islam, but between Muslims and non-Muslims. A kind of highly westernized veneer for their conduct. And in many ways a Western mindset. That kind of approach, and the explanation or justification for that is that this is really what the Quran tells us to do. The Quran tells us to accommodate, the Quran tells us to adjust. He had the famous ayah of La ikraha fi din, there is no compunction in religion, at the gateway of the university. And again, there is a reflection of that mindset, as it were, today. There's a number of institutions and institutes that call for interfaith understanding, intercultural, but mainly within a Western perspective. That we have accepted that the Western paradigm is the correct one, and that everything else that stands against the rational and scientific advance of man is un-Islamic, actually, is what he was saying. So, his influence upon the Muslims of India, and from that perspective, was vast. He had also another influence, and that is by crystallizing the concerns of the Muslim community in India, and by giving it a certain set of hoped-for privileged relationships with the British. He allowed the British really to start the process of divide and rule once again. The British latched onto this as a way of maintaining basically a strong ally amongst the Muslim elites, who were before seen as their enemies. They were now seen as their natural allies against the Hindus, and they were used quite frequently by the British to stand against Hindu demands for Hindu and Muslim, but mainly Hindu demands for independence in India, by creating or by positing the existence of a very large community in India that has its own unique features. So he's seen in Pakistan as one of the founders of Pakistan, in the sense that he crystallized the idea of Muslim identity in India, and therefore transformed the Ummah into a nation, and therefore opened the door for the political definition of Muslims in India as a territorial definition.
I would have thought it would be the opposite, because it seems that all these activities seem to be watering down the Islamic identity, not making any distance between the Muslims and the Kuffar.
True, but that's how you see it. As I said, there's a large number of people amongst the Muslim Indian elites, and now in Pakistan, who ascribe to this view. So they see him both as an enlightened figure, but at the same time a person who highlighted the uniqueness of Muslims inside India. And by highlighting the uniqueness of Muslims inside India, he allowed Muslims to basically to demand peculiar rights for them as a community. So from there really, there was, in his latter days he resisted the idea of the Indian Congress as being a unifying party of Muslims and Indians. And he said that Muslims have a special, unique set of features and characteristics as dwellers in India that are not the same as those of the Hindu majority population. And in the process, he basically convinced the British to treat the Muslims in India separately, as a separate category of people from the Hindus. Once that started, then it led subsequently to the establishment of political parties. So if you go to Pakistan now, there are a large number of schools named after him. So Syed, Ahmad, model school, this and that. His influence or his effects over the years, I think, was fundamental, not only by creating a set of, or by positing a set of values that were uniquely his. I mean, his understanding of Islam is in some cases unique. And he had, I would say, the courage really to expound it in a way that was quite daring, and to accept the hostility, and there were frequent attempts on his life also. He was a very big man, very bulky. There was some courage, but whether his overall influence was for good or bad, I'm really not prepared to judge. All I can say is that there's a large segment of the intelligentsia of the Indian subcontinent, and there's quite a few of them around now, like Professor Akbar Ahmad. Professor Akbar Ahmad, you've seen his program on Islam. He's a great apologist for Syed Ahmad, and he thinks, in fact, that this is the correct Islam. Those who are more, politically active, or those who are more doctrinaire in their thinking, see that line entirely as being someone who's treacherous, apologist at best.
Is this the same individual who's now in the past coming up?
No, he's now a professor at Islamic Studies at Cambridge. He comes up on TV. He's one of the great apologists, as I say. And I think, if you want to link people such as the whole movement for intercommunal understanding between Muslims and Christians, the movement associated with Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan, some of those, I don't want to mention names, were involved in interfaith dialogue and so on. It falls under the broader category of, Islam is a non-threatening religion, it's a religion of peace and brotherhood and so on. And it falls under the category of Islam is seen as a highly personal and individual relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In some ways, I would say this is perhaps this individualist relationship rather than a community relationship is peculiar to those who have a religious sensibility, but do not want to project it on a social or communal basis.